This video is about the story of Elden Ring. This will cover all the important characters relevant to the main story, including most bosses and some NPCs, as well as explain what happened before we arrive in the lands between, who we play as, and what the endings of the game mean. Sections of this video are separated via chapters located on the timeline should you need to rewatch a specific section again. As always, spoiler warning ahead, if you haven't beaten Elden Ring, I highly recommend you do that and then come back, as everything after this point will be spoiler territory. With that out of the way, like the video if you enjoy, and let's get started. So the location of Elden Ring is in a place called the Lands Between. This is a land ruled by a Queen Marika. It was once ruled by a dragon lord, but it said that when its god abandoned them, they sat in slumber awaiting their return, which left the spot for the ruler open. This title was given to her by someone known as the Greater Will. When you become the ruler of the Lands Between, you also become a vessel for the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring is the single most powerful thing in the Lands Between. Its power is what created the Erdtree, and it is meant to uphold different concepts like life, death, space, and many others. It also defines the logic of the world called the Golden Order, which is a law the residents of the Lands Between abide by. The Greater Will is an outer god, and it's said to have sent down a star that held a beast that would later become the Elden Ring. The Elden Beast, the final boss of the game, is defined as a vassal for the Greater Will and the living embodiment of the concept of order. To become the ruler of the Lands Between, the ruler will need three things. They need to be an Empyrean and must have a consort and a shadow. A consort is just the spouse that they marry, who in Marika's case was Godrick. A shadow is the protector of that ruler, and an Empyrean is someone who is born from a single god. Talking with Ranni towards the end of her questline reveals that her, Mikola, and Melania are considered Empyreans.
Let us speak of the past a while. I was once an Empyrean, of the demigods. Only I, Mikola, and Melania could claim that title. Each of us was chosen by our own two fingers, as a candidate to succeed Queen Marika, to become the new god of the coming age.
That means there is a clear distinction between a demigod like Godrick and an Empyrean like Melania. Melania, Mikola, and Ranni are still considered demigods, but there is that Empyrean part of them that separates them from the rest. The question, though, is how is this possible? So when Marika became the first ruler, she wasn't fond of the idea of death in her land, so she removed the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring and forced it onto her shadow, who was Meliketh. Instead of protecting her as the shadow would, she betrayed him and just used him as a way to keep the death away from her land. With the Rune of Death out of the Elden Ring, it allowed Marika and many others to gain immortality. Shortly after this, she needed a consort who would then be Godfrey, and now that Godfrey was her husband, he also received the title of Elden Lord, making him the first Elden Lord. This isn't entirely true, as there is a lore that does suggest the very first Elden Lord was possibly Dragon Lord Placidus that we fight in Fara Missoula, but I think either no one knew of the Dragon Lord or Godfrey was the first Elden Lord during his own age, which was the Age of the Erdtree, which was much later than when Placidus was Elden Lord. Regardless, Godfrey and Marika had two kids, which were Godwyn and Godrick. This is easily identifiable thanks to the God prefix in their names. There were more kids besides them, but more on them later. During this time, war had been going on against the Golden Order, and another person named Radahn had been involved in the conflict, but decided to usher peace by marrying Lady Rennala, queen of the Carian royal family. When the two were together, they ended up having children as well, being named Radahn, Rykard, and Ranni. Once again, all of them start with an R, just like Radahn and Rennala's first name. After the war had finished, it was said that the hue of Godfrey's eyes had faded, possibly meaning he had served his purpose and was no longer needed, as soon after he was exiled and became the very first Tarnished. But now Marika is without a consort, so she sought out Radahn. Radahn then left Rennala and joined Marika at the Erdtree and became her new husband and the new Elden Lord. And since he was an Elden Lord, his children by proxy were allowed to be a part of the royal family, which is why they have thrones at the royal capital despite not being Marika's offspring. Once again, Radahn and Marika were together, and they had even more kids, that being the twins Mikola and Melania. This may stir up some confusion, as I just mentioned that an Empyrean has to be born from a single god, yet Ranni, Mikola, and Melania were all born by two parents. Well, as we discover later in the game, Marika is Radahn. There's a statue in Leyndell that has a riddle that says, "Regression alone reveals secrets." By using the spell Laws of Regression in front of the statue, it changes its form and the text changes to Radahn is Marika. Now, I'll be completely honest, it is never explained how this happened and what exactly this means, and it's probably the biggest question that has been unanswered so far in the community. Some have come up with some theories regarding this, such as the two being separate entities who were fused together somehow, or it's one body that suffers from dissociative identity disorder. order. However, the other question that remains is who was first, although I do believe there is an answer to this. Given the Empyrean status and the greater will giving her the lands between, I think Queen Marika was first. But this riddle now explains why Radahn left Rennala for Marika and why Miquella and Malenia are considered Empyrean since their parents are the same person, which then fits the rules of that one god stipulation. This has been quite the family tree, so a huge shout out to Just Am Bling on Reddit for creating this easy to read graphic. The only outliers here at the moment are Marika's parents, but seeing as she's an Empyrean, it's not as simple to answer, plus we get zero info on her parents anyway. But besides them, the only one left is Malekith, Marika's shadow and the keeper of the Rune of Death. According to his armor description, Malekith is actually her half-brother who wielded a blade imbued with the Rune of Death. This is a good time to explain this, as if you noticed from the actual description, it says Destined Death. Well, the finger reader at the Roundtable Hold clarifies that the Rune of Death goes by two names and the other is Destined Death.
The Rune of Death goes by two names. The other is Destined Death, the forbidden shadow plucked from the Golden Order upon its creation.
For simplicity's sake, unless entirely necessary, I will refer to it as just the Rune of Death to avoid any further confusion. The final character of this family tree we haven't thoroughly talked about is Ranni. Earlier in the game, a witch known as Renna meets with us. However, this is Ranni. She's just using a different name in order to disguise her identity. Ranni was born under Rennala and Radahn, two separate people, yet is considered an Empyrean. It's still not clear as to why this is the case, but my only working theory is that Rennala is her adoptive mother, but we'll discuss that in the bosses chapter. Regardless, it's not that big of a deal anyway, since she didn't want to be an Empyrean. This sequence of events would eventually lead to the Shattering. Depending on who you ask, the Shattering might be considered the greatest war ever fought or the worst tragedy the land has ever seen. Ranni, wanting to be anything but an Empyrean, worked against Marika, the Greater Will, and the Two Fingers and devised a plan. One day, she stole the Rune of Death from Malekith. With that power, she created daggers able to kill the demigods. On that same night, called the Night of the Black Knives, a group of assassins called the Black Knife Assassins would kill the first demigod, Godwyn. It's also interesting to note here that according to the Black Knife armor description, all of the members of this group were women, and they're all rumored to be Numen, which you may remember as one of the default races in the character creation. They also have close ties to Marika, which may mean that Marika is of Numen descent. It doesn't really give us much regarding her backstory, but it is worth knowing anyway. Back to the intro, when Godwyn was killed, he had a mark on his body. This is considered the Curse Mark of Death, an item we could receive during Ranni's questline. This curse mark appeared the moment Godwyn was killed, but this symbol, however, is incomplete as it should have been a full circle. The reason it's only half is because two demigods died at the same time, breaking the curse in two half circles. The other god was Ranni herself. As Ranni says, she wanted to strip away her Empyrean flesh so that nothing of her was related to the Two Fingers. Both of these demigods had the opposite happen to them. Ranni's body was dead, but her soul lived on, and Godwyn's soul was destroyed, but his body survived. This not only explains why Ranni's new body is a doll, but also why Godwyn was seemingly reborn after he was killed. Godwyn was given the name the Prince of Death because of this encounter and is related to Fia's questline where she tries to resurrect him. After hearing the news of Godwyn's death, Marika, possibly in a fit of rage, shattered the Elden Ring. One thing to remember, of course, is the distinction between Radahn and Marika, because Marika's hammer reads the tool with which Queen Marika shattered the Elden Ring, and Radahn attempted to repair it. This is once again left up to the community to decide, as it's never explained, but my working theory, and furthermore my theory between Radahn and Marika, is that originally they were separate people, but something fused them together, possibly the Greater Will. In regards to the Shattering situation, I think each of them, despite being the same person, act differently, which explains why Marika specifically broke the ring and why Radahn specifically is trying to repair it. With the shards of the Elden Ring scattered everywhere across the lands between, all the demigods were attempting to gather all the shards. The intro then shows a slideshow of some of the demigods, like Mo, the Lord of Blood, taking Miquella away, a serpent biting a helmet, which is related to Rykard, symbolizing how he became the Lord Serpent, and then the iconic fight between Malenia and Radahn. The problem is that during this war, nobody won. The land was stuck in a stalemate, with the demigods that were left standing holding pieces of the Elden Ring, but nobody was close to owning all of them. This stalemate left things unchanged, and the land was covered in ruins, with some areas like Caelid being covered in rot and disease. Furthermore, none of the demigods are making moves on each other as they preferred to defend their land rather than fight to take others' land and subsequently the shards. So something was needed to break this stalemate, which is where we come in. We are called Tarnished. During the age before the Shattering, called the Age of the Erd Tree, the golden power of the Erd Tree would drop down from its branches and spread across the lands between. It blessed many throughout the land, but also refused to bless others for an unknown reason. These people were considered Tarnished, those who aren't worthy of the Erd Tree and are looked down upon by the eyes of the Golden Order. This exile we received is similar to Godfrey's exile, as he was deemed useless by the Greater Will and the Golden Order, which is symbolized by him losing the golden color in his eyes. We are deemed unworthy by the Greater Will, so it has no use for us in the lands between, which means we're considered tarnished and are forced to leave. But when the Shattering occurred, the lands between was in disarray, and because it still wanted to hold on to its power, the Greater Will blessed the previously exiled Tarnished in hopes that it will return and restore the Golden Order. It was even able to bless many Tarnished who are dead like us. Of the other Tarnished, the important ones listed in the intro are Horalu, Chieftain of the Badlands, the Brilliant Gold Mask, Fia the Deathbed Companion, the Loathsome Dung Eater, and Gideon Ulfnir the All-Knowing. Our objective as this new Tarnished is to cross the fog back into the lands between, stand before the Elden Ring, and become the Elden Lord. The key here, however, is Elden Lord, not the ruler, meaning we are never meant to usurp Marika from her position, merely bring the runes together so that everything can go back to normal.
Confer great runes to become Elden Lord and join Queen Marika as her consort. The fingers have willed it so.
This, however, did not happen thanks to us committing the very first cardinal sin later in the game, which was the burning of the Erd Tree, and more on that a bit later. So as a Tarnished resident of the lands between, we are eagerly ready to take on the demigods until we're killed by the first enemy we face. But we are somehow able to get back up again. Vare, right at the beginning of the game, explains that the guidance of grace, the same light that guides us towards the bosses in game, is what gives us Tarnished life, meaning it can revive us. It's also possible that the Rune of Death also affects us too, since the removal of the rune made people immortal in the lands between, which may explain our revival. For those who don't know, most if not all the Soulsborne games always had a reason as to why death was canon, so it's hard to believe that it wouldn't exist in Elden Ring 2. After exploring the lands between, we'll run into Melina, the girl from earlier in the intro. She tells us that she will become our finger maiden since we are maidenless, except later she apologizes as she isn't actually a maiden. So she offers us a deal. If we can continue to work with her and bring her to the foot of the Erd Tree so that she can meet with her mother and discover her purpose, she will continue to act as our maiden and allow us to level up. There's a lot more to Melina's story, but I'll save that for later when we discuss the endings. After some time, she will then introduce us to the Roundtable Hold, the covert operation base for the Two Fingers, and a place where Tarnished champions guided by grace can reside. Most of them, however, don't seem too keen on becoming Elden Lord. In fact, it only really feels like us and Gideon are really working towards that goal. Many of them just seem to want to save shelter away from the danger outside. According to Gideon, we aren't going to get a proper welcome into the Round Table though until we defeat a Shardbearer, and the first one we can defeat is Godrick. But before we meet Godrick, we have to talk about Margit. Margit, the Fell Omen, is a recurring character in the game, as he not only shows up again in the Altus Plateau, but also shows up at the foot of the Erd Tree under the name Morgoth the Omen King. Earlier I talked about children we haven't discussed yet, and that is Morgoth and Mo. If you remember from before, we talked about how Miquella and Malenia are twins. This is the same with Morgoth and Mo. Godrick's Great Rune says that Elden Lord Godfrey and his offspring were the very first demigods, and that line of children was known as the Golden Lineage. Morgoth's rune says that he was a part of this golden lineage, and Mo's Great Rune says that him and Morgoth are twins, so it makes sense that they're a part of the lineage together. However, a curse afflicted both of them. Omen babies born of royalty do not have their horns cut, but instead are kept underground and imprisoned for eternity. It seems that they were permanently chained, as we can find an item called Margit's Shackle, which is a small part of a few larger shackles that were made to bind Margit. Morgoth, once again also known as Margit, was cursed, but it seems like he didn't hold any ill will against the Golden Order, as despite never being loved by anyone, he still continued to give out his own love and become the Erd Tree's protector. As for his twin, during his imprisonment, Mo was sought out by someone only known as the Formless Mother. The Formless Mother is an outer god similar to the Greater Will, but with more sinister plans. He, by the will of the Formless Mother, was attempting to make Miquella the new ruler of the lands between. He would then rule as his consort, and the Formless Mother would then be able to control the lands between, just as the Greater Will can now. Miquella and Malenia once again men were twins born from Radahn and Marika, and since they're the same person, this fit within the rules of them being an Empyrean. This explains why Mo wants Mikola as the ruler and not himself, because he isn't an Empyrean. According to more item descriptions, the Formless Mother only seeks out those of accursed blood, which is why he was chosen. It also seems like he couldn't just make Mikola become the ruler right away, because Mikola hasn't achieved full godhood yet. It's unclear why, but it could be related to Mikola's own curse, something we'll discuss a bit later. Getting back on track, after Margit we can meet with Godrick the Grafted. Godrick rose to power through the act of grafting. According to Rajir, he states that there are Tarnished hunters in this castle that will take our corpse to Godrick so that we can be grafted to him. It's clear that Godrick ruled his castle with fear, as not many would dare oppose him out of fear of becoming a part of him. So it's quite hilarious when you return to his arena and find one of his servants kicking his corpse repeatedly. Godrick was a feeble old man with no real power, but he wanted to prove to the others that he deserved the title of Lord by using fear and manipulation to get his way. But it's quite obvious that he's bluffing, as without the grafting, he's barely even a competent fighter. Our next boss we meet is Lady Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon. The Academy of Raya Lucaria was at odds with a group called the Carian Royal Family. Both practiced different versions of glintstone magic and attempted to be the better sorcerers, but due to the age of the Erd Tree, many of its residents in the lands between found power and hope in the Golden Order, making glintstone sorcery useless. The royal family then withered away during this time, and so did the Academy, but it wasn't until the Shattering that the Academy had a resurgence in power. In her youth, Rennala became a prominent champion who charmed the Academy with her lunar magic. She also commanded the Glintstone Knights and established the House of Caria as royalty. However, despite being a champion and a renowned sorceress, she became heartbroken thanks to Radahn leaving her. She then became a shell of her former self, and it was only then that the Academy members discovered that she wasn't a champion after all. Later, the Academy would then rebel against the Carian royal family, then lock her away in the Grand Library. Shortly after this, the Shattering would occur, so the Academy was permanently locked down as no one wanted to participate in the Shattering, so they were left out of the destruction. Upon entering the Grand Library, we can see a ton of kids as well as Lady Rennala holding an amber egg in her arms. After defeating her first phase, Ranni starts speaking, saying that we're trespassing and are not allowed to disturb her. As we know, Ranni is the daughter of Rennala, but this doesn't make a whole lot of sense though, as Ranni is an Empyrean who was born from two parents, which leads me to believe that Rennala is the adoptive mother and not the birth mother of Ranni. Regarding this whole sequence, I also think this was a spell casted by Ranni just in case anyone had intentions of harming Rennala. Not only is the boss arena completely different, but right after defeating her again, we can see that she is just lying on the ground. This leads me to believe that this spell was an illusion made by Ranni so that she could protect her. That egg she carries, however, is the last thing ever given to her by Radahn before he left. It seems to also have the power of rebirth, so either she is holding on to this item because he gave it to her and it's quite precious to her, or she's possibly waiting for the eventual rebirth of Radahn through this egg. I hope it's not the latter, as that wish won't come true since Radahn is clearly alive. Regardless of its significance, it's clear that Rennala still hasn't gotten over her ex-husband and has been ruined because of it. She is no longer the Queen of the Full Moon and is barely even a sorcerer anymore. During her boss fight, the kids are actually more troublesome than she is, with her only attack being the occasional chandelier falling. After fending off the illusion, we then can return to Rennala, who gives up her Great Rune and offers us a chance to respec our stats. Seeing as we have the Great Rune and she is clearly in no state to fight, there's no reason to kill her, so we just let her live. Our third boss is Radahn, who resides in Caelid, a land that has been infested with scarlet rot thanks to Malenia and her curse. Radahn is considered a champion of the Shattering and may have one of the best backstories in this whole game. When Radahn was younger, he looked up to Godfrey as he loved how strong he was in battle. So when Radahn was able to wear his own personal armor, he had a chest piece made with a lion on the front to symbolize Godfrey's beast regent, Sirash. He also looked up to his father and was proud of his accomplishments, so he grew out his long red hair and wore it with pride. As he grew older, he started taking after these two figures in his life and wanted to become as strong as they were. But whether it was because of genetics or the amount of strength he received during this, he started growing in size. This troubled him, as due to his size and weight, he wouldn't be able to ride his horse that he's had for his whole life. So he went to Sela in Caelid, which is called the Town of Sorcery. It was there where he learned gravitational magic and was able to manipulate the ground around him and be able to call swords to his hands, but more importantly, he was also able to affect his own body weight, meaning he could ride his horse without crushing it. We know this not only because we can see him do many attacks attacks while using gravity, but the symbol for gravity magic is the same symbol on his swords. Furthermore, it's known that the Elden Ring commands the stars just as it commands the other concepts of the world like life and death, but General Radahn is considered the Star Scourge and seems to be able to control the stars. This is because the cutscene after his death has all the previous stars held in the sky by him come crashing down, one of which actually lands right near us, causing a massive explosion. But the difference between General Radahn and many of the other boss fights is that it's not a normal boss fight, as upon entering Caelid and making our way to the back of the castle, we can see that there is other people here. Blythe and Alexander are here, assuming you met with them prior, as well as other characters we may meet in the future like Okina, Leyndell, and Targeth. The reason they are here is because they're all participating in the Radahn Festival, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity where you can face General Radahn in battle and claim his great rune. We can summon all these people to fight with us, including many people who weren't there for the festival, such as a Finger Maiden and even Patches. The organizer of the festival gives us a backstory of Radahn, and his current state is not too great. If you recall from an old trailer, Malenia and Radahn fought at this very place. Well, during this fight, Malenia pierced Radahn, injecting scarlet rot into his body. Do you remember earlier when I said that the twins were cursed? Well, whereas Miquella is cursed to an eternal childhood, never becoming anything older than a boy, Malenia is cursed by being forced to harbor a rot within inside her body. All the rot in Caelid is most likely because of her. We can see the effect that it has on her face and limbs, but when we get to phase 2 of the boss fight, we can not only see how much of her body's been affected, but also how much control she has over this disease. Getting back to Radahn, she ended up using this rot to corrupt him. Now he is just a blood-hungry beast, with the only thing on his mind about what his next meal is going to be and what the next kill will be. This festival seems to have been created by Radahn himself or by an organizer trying to help Radahn. Jiren is the name of the organizer here at the castle, and after defeating Radahn, he thanks us for the fight, as not only was that a spectacular battle, but we were able to give Radahn his final wish, which was to die an honorable death. He couldn't stand the current state he was living in and wanted someone to end his life, but it would be dishonorable for a general like him to die from suicide or surrender, so an honorable fight to the death was the only way for him to feel at peace. But now that General Radahn is dead, there is only one rune left. Praetor Rykard is a unique case in the world of the Lands Between. He lies at the bottom of Mount Gelmir, the location of the most appalling battle in the Shattering. Rykard committed the grave sin of blasphemy. He spoke out against the Golden Order as he was bothered by the Greater Will and the Golden Order's willingness to just cast aside those deemed unworthy for no reason. Many people would flock to Rykard and his castle, the Volcano Manor, but people started having doubts about his decision. A spirit near the castle is seen atop a pile of bodies in pain, and says that if he had known that this blasphemy would have caused this much destruction, he wouldn't have tolerated his decision. Given that many of those in the Lands Between believe in the Golden Order, it's quite obvious why many would hate Rykard and his followers, as they're actively going against what they preach. This probably led to many crusades against Rykard, which negatively impacted the livelihoods of all his people. Upon entering the manor, we can meet Tanith. She then asks us if we've ever harbored any doubts about the guidance of grace and the Golden Order, and if we do say yes, then she'll invite us to the Volcano Manor family. She goes on to explain that the Tarnished were blessed with grace like everyone else in the Lands Between, but it's clear that the Tarnished didn't get their fair share. Rykard refused to bow down to this and believes that if the Erdtree would debase them, then they're willing to go against the Golden Order even if it's considered heresy. So as a member, our job is to seek out those who are aligned with the Erdtree and the Golden Order. This is in the form of a few NPCs we are tasked with invading, but the manor also gives us a recusant finger, which allows us to invade other players' worlds. So all the players we invade are technically the Tarnished she speaks of, which is why we're tasked with eliminating them. After a few contracts have been completed, upon coming back, we see a spirit sitting in the corner. He's preaching to the manor and hopes someone will heed his words. He wants us to eliminate the Great Serpent, the one who devoured Praetor Rykard. Seeing as it was him against the whole kingdom, since everyone disagreed with him and continued to align with the Golden Order, Praetor Rykard required more power so that he may fight on an even level. This is when he met the Great Serpent. It seems that the Serpent promised him power as long as Rykard was willing to be eaten by him. Rykard agreed and became the Lord Serpent. Thankfully, this spirit has given us a way to defeat him by letting us know of the power that resides in the Serpent Hunter, a weapon specifically designed to kill the serpent. The fight is quite trivial with this weapon, as it should be, but during his second phase he pulls out a sword, and as we can see from the weapon, it has moving hands, which were all from his previous victims. It's quite sad to think about all the people in their past lives and accomplishments now being withered down to nothing, as now they're just a part of the Serpent family stuck in this hell forever. We can actually talk to some of the members of the Volcano Manor after defeating Rykard, and none of them seem upset. Bernal believes that the strong take and the weak suffer, so by killing him we proved that Rykard was weak. Tanith even agrees and thanks us for showing them how weak Rykard really was. The only problem is that Rykard's immortal. It just takes time for him to get back to full strength, and should we return to the boss arena, we can see Rykard's body repairing itself while Tanith holds him. So it seems that Rykard will eventually come back. How long that will take is unknown, but just like before, we have the Great Runes, so currently our job is done. With all the Great Runes in our possession, we can travel to Leyndell, the royal capital, and go to the Erd Tree. Here is where we meet numerous knights and tree sentinels, truly showing how powerful this army really is. There is also a 1-to-1 version of the Roundtable Hold in here. This is most likely the real Roundtable, and the one we're taken to is just a copy, since the Shattering ruined much of the land and caused its residents to close off its walls. As we remember, only certain people can enter the Roundtable. It's not a building that people can just waltz right into, which may explain why on the map the Roundtable Hold is off to the very side, symbolizing that it's separate than the one in the lands between. On top of this, since we made it to the capital, Melina leaves our side since we fulfilled our deal and brought her to the Erd Tree. But when we ourselves get close to the Erd Tree, Godfrey attempts to stop us. This is clearly a spirit version of him, and it's possible given the golden color that it's Godfrey's remembrance from during the war before he was a Tarnished. All the remembrances we gather in-game are memories of the bosses, and these memories are all a part of the Erd Tree. Later in the game, we will actually end up fighting Godfrey in his actual form, but when we defeat him, he drops the remembrance of Horalu, not the remembrance of Godfrey, which leads me to my previous conclusion. After him is when we meet Morgott, and since we already discussed him quite a bit, I won't repeat myself. However, he does let us know who the thrones are for, which was Godrick, Miquella, Malenia, Radahn, Rykard, and Ranni. He also calls them all traitors, which is quite interesting. I think it's because Morgott believes that they are fighting so they can claim the power of the Elden Ring for themselves and become the new Elden Lord, but Morgott, being the protector of the Erd Tree, finds this a disgraceful act, as it's clear that they only really care about the power that comes with the Elden Lord title, and not about protecting the Erd Tree and the Golden Order. After defeating Morgott, we can talk to him momentarily, and he calls us a fool, saying that the Erd Tree doesn't open for anyone, and that no one will be able to claim the title of Elden Lord, and it seems that Morgott himself tried to attempt this and wasn't allowed inside. To prove his statement, we walk up the steps and discover we can't enter. The Erd Tree has rejected us. The Erd Tree is covered by impassable thorns that cannot be cut. Melina then arrives again and explains to be Elden Lord we must pass through the thorns, and the only way to burn them is to go to the snowy mountaintops of the giants and use its smoldering flame to set the Erd Tree on fire. We can then talk to the Finger Reader back at the Roundtable Hold to get more insight on this, and she goes on to explain that because of this sudden turn of events, which is us being rejected by the Erd Tree, the Two Fingers is currently consulting with the Greater Will, but we likely won't get an answer for thousands of years. We then tell her our immediate plan to burn the thorns and is shocked by the idea, claiming that the Snowy Mountains is not a place for mere men and that burning the Erd Tree is the First Cardinal Sin, something the Fingers and the Greater Will never agree to. Furthermore, we then explain our next step in the process, which is to unleash the Rune of Death. When we make it to the highest point in the mountains, we talk with Melina, who tells us that she will be the kindling required to burn the tree. Earlier, the Finger Reader told us that this ritual requires a sacrifice, and Melina is willing to be that sacrifice. Before she disappears, though, she does deliver a few words and goes on to say that throughout her life she has seen death and discrimination everywhere, convincing her that the lands between is in dire need of repair. This sort of implies that she has lived quite a long life, something that connects to a theory of mine later in the game. As we touch hands once more, she takes our power and uses it and the smoldering flames nearby to create a flame big enough to set her and the tree ablaze. Afterwards, we wake up in Fara Missoula. Not much is known about this place, but I believe this was the temple in the sky. Throughout the lands between are ruins of a fallen city. The ruin fragments we pick up are believed to be a part of a temple in the sky, and the only place in-game that fits that description would be Fara Missoula. As we explore the area, we run into the Beast Clergyman again, the same one in Caelid who we give the death root to, assuming you followed through with that questline. He then attacks us since we are clearly here to steal the Rune of Death from him, and he doesn't want it stolen again. This is a nice piece of foreshadowing, as soon after defeating him, he reveals his true form to be Malekith the Black Blade, the shadow of Marika and the owner of the Rune of Death. Now it makes sense why we were feeding him Deathroot during his questline, as the description reads, after the death of Godwyn, the Rune of Death spread across the lands between through the underground roots of the Great Tree, sprouting in the form of Deathroot. Malekith, being the owner of the Rune of Death, would obviously want his power back, so by consuming the Deathroot, we are giving it back to him. Upon his death, a weird object sprouts from his shadowy ashes. This is the Rune of Death, and because it's unbound, the lands between are now shrouded in a dark fate, and the Greater Will is not happy about that. We pass out again and awake in Leyndell, but now it's covered in ashes. It seems like we have a straight path to the Erd Tree now, but nothing is ever simple in this game. Blocking our path is Gideon and Godfrey. Gideon appears in Godfrey's chamber and the long-awaited fight ensues. Gideon and us have been gunning for the Elden Lord position all game, so it was only a matter of time before we faced off together, except that's not what's happening. Gideon immediately says that nobody will become the Elden Lord, and that Marika has plans for all of us, and that plan being that we struggle for eternity. So why this sudden change of heart? Gideon, during his journey to obtain all knowledge, may have uncovered some details about Marika that changed his mind. The all-knowing helmet description reads, "Knowledge begins with the recognition of one's ignorance, the realization that the search of knowledge is unending." But when Gideon glimpsed into the will of Queen Marika, he shuddered in fear. At the end, that should not be. Something terrified Gideon so much that completely changed his mind about being the Elden Lord. My guess was most likely the relationship between the Greater Will and Marika, or maybe even the Elden Beast as well. As for Godfrey, he appears in normal human form this time, and we can see him holding Morgott in his arms. Godfrey then spots us and recognizes us immediately as the Tarnished warrior, the one who's been conquering many before him. Godfrey wants to obtain the Elden Lord title again, and since that conflicts with our goals, we have to fight him. After half his health is gone, he uses Siraj to gain more power and reveals that his true form is Hoarah, the chieftain of the Badlands. When Godfrey and the other Tarnished had been forced out of the lands between, this act was called the Long March, and when the Long March had finished, Godfrey and the other Tarnished had started their own civilization. And it was during this time that Godfrey possibly wanted to cut all ties away from him in the lands between, so he adopted the name Hoarah. However, with Godfrey finished, nothing stands in our way. When we enter the room, we see Marika chained to a part of the Elden Ring, but eventually she breaks free, but her hair turns red and we realize that Radahn is now in control. It seems to me that their bodies change when one takes control, as Marika and Radahn seem to have different physiques when viewed up close, like Marika having a skinnier body in the absence of breasts when Radahn is in control. This may not be entirely true, however, since it's quite hard to look at their bodies while you're being attacked, but this at least confirms that there are two people in one body. However, we still don't know if they were two separate people that then became one, or if it was always one body to begin with. After the fight is over, Radahn starts becoming engulfed in a black mist as a hand reaches out and takes him underneath the pool of sludge. Out of this sludge arises the Elden Beast, probably one of the coolest looking bosses in the Soulsborne franchise. We've already discussed the Elden Beast in detail earlier, but as a reminder, the Elden Beast is the vassal for the Greater Will and is the living embodiment of the concept of order. But the question is, why are we fighting Radahn and the Elden Beast in the first place? Remember, the point of our journey was to become the Elden Lord and be a consort for Marika, so why are they killing the one person who is able to fill that role? One is possibly due to the fact that we are tarnished, and even attempting to become Elden Lord does go against the Golden Order, but it may also have to do with the Greater Will and a secret agenda that it has. It's clear that the Greater Will wants Marika as the ruler of the lands between, and to have the Elden Ring repaired so the Golden Order can be stable again. But since that stalemate occurred, it needed help, which is why I called the Tarnished back to the lands between. The Greater Will more than likely had a plan in mind, but since we burned the Erd Tree and unbound the Rune of Death, it most likely casted all of that aside and just opted to kill us as we committed a cardinal sin. Regardless of its intentions, the Elden Beast is defeated and the Greater Will seems to have no power over the lands between anymore. It's unclear whether or not the Greater Will is truly dead though, or if its power is truly gone, as the Elden Beast is just a vassal for the Greater Will, which is much different than a vessel. Marika is a vessel for the Elden Ring, whereas the Elden Beast is a vassal for the Greater Will, so it acts in accordance to the Greater Will's wishes. So I think the Greater Will still does exist in some way, but doesn't really have as much control over the lands between as it used to. With the Elden Beast slain, we now reach the ending of the game, and it's here where I have to be a bit honest with all of you. I don't know all the endings of Elden Ring, and depending on when you watch this video, you don't either. Despite what many believe, there is in fact more than 4 endings in the game, and at the time of making this video, there is a total of 6 confirmed endings with a 7 still under investigation. I normally don't make these videos until everything has been discovered so we can get the full picture, but this could take an undetermined amount of time to figure out, so if you'll forgive me, I'd like to discuss these endings with all of you anyway. So the very first ending is the default one, that all players will be able to obtain, which is the Age of Fracture. This shows the player mending the body and runes back together and becoming the Elden Lord like we set out to do. The lands between seems to go back to normal, but is a fractured version of what it once was thanks to the Shattering and all the demigods we slayed on our path here. The next 3 endings are all tied to character quests and are the same ending but with slight alterations in 2 different places. The Age of Duskborn is from Fia's questline, where we use the mending rune of the Death Prince she provides us at the end of her questline as a way to mend all the runes back together. But instead of it being a normal looking pattern, the curse mark appears at the bottom, and instead of a normal looking sky, there's a grey mist that covers the land. This seems to imply that the Rune of Death is back in the Elden Ring, which hasn't happened since before Marika's reign, meaning the death will come to the Lands Between once more, and immortality is a thing of the past. The Blessing of Despair is the third version of this ending, and is activated upon completion of the Dung Eater questline, and using the Mending Rune of the Fell Curse, which leaves a sizable clump of disease on Marika's body. The land once again changes, but to a brown and reddish tint, and possibly implies that the Dung Eater got his wish. He has a dream of blessing the people with a curse that starts with all the people he's defiled and killed. They will then be reborn and create children who harbor their curse, and those children will have their own children who harbor that curse until everyone is afflicted by it. The fourth variation of this ending that we know of is the Age of Order, which is done by completing Brother Corrin and the Gold Mask questline, where on the body of the Gold Mask will be the Mending Rune of Perfect Order needed to complete this ending. Just as before, it's the exact same ending with the same differences. This rune is of a transcendental ideology that will attempt to perfect the Golden Order. This is symbolized in the pattern being the same as before, but with a large circle around it. As for the differences, the sky seems to be the same golden color, but now the Erd Tree is golden once again. Our last two endings are different from the ones we have discussed so far. The Lord of Frenzied Flame is the opposite of the other endings that we just discussed, where the Tarnished will become the Lord of Chaos. They then burn the Erd Tree and most likely leave the Lands Between. To do this, you must complete the quest route of the Three Fingers, which ends with the Three Fingers grabbing and marking you. However, depending on when you do this, another cutscene will play. If done after Melina sacrifices herself, then the ending plays out like normal. But if you're marked upon arriving, Melina leaves your side and promises that if you go down this path, she will have no choice but to hunt you down. Now, if you choose this ending, every other ending is locked, unless you use an item called Miquella's Needle, which reverts the marking, allowing you to choose the other endings again. This is why she mentions that part about going down the current path, is we do have the option to change our mind. But assuming we don't, and Melina knows that we're marked, a second cutscene will play, where Melina grabs what is presumed to be the whistle we used to summon Torrent and then vows to hunt us down. We also see that her left eye is now open and has a purple color to it, whereas the right eye that is used to be yellow is now faded. This has led many to believe, including me, that Melina in some way is related to Ranni. In the story trailer for the game, Ranni is seen with the right eye closed and the left one open, and the spirit form next to her has her left eye shut and the right eye open. But it's the same eye, which is the trailer possibly telling us that these two beings are related, and the only person with her left eye shut throughout the game is Melina. This could also explain why Melina seemingly appears wherever we are, as the spirit form she is just able to teleport in and out of existence. The final ending is called the Age of Stars, and it's available upon the completion of Ranni's questline. We summon Ranni from inside the Erd Tree, where she then picks up and places Marika's head onto her body, just like we've done in the previous endings. She then goes on to make a promise to all the living beings and souls that exist in the world, and says that the Age of Stars has commenced, and that the 1,000-year voyage underneath the wisdom of the moon is about to begin. Possibly meaning that the people are no longer bound by the forces of a god and can act on their own free will. We then become her spouse, and she becomes the new ruler, but you may be asking, how is that possible, as while Ranni was an Empyrean, she claimed to have stripped away her Empyrean flesh, so that can't make her a ruler. Well, there is a lot to unpack with this ending, and is quite difficult to interpret given how little we actually have to go off of, but it seems that Ranni wants to have the moon and stars under control again, as it's possible this was the large governing force of the world before the greater will arrived. This would make sense given that she wanted to break away from her Empyrean body, and since the greater will is out of the picture, this concept of Empyreans is unnecessary now. This is what leads me to my previous conclusion, that the people of the world will no longer be bound by the influence of a higher power and can think on their own. These are all the endings we have so far. The seventh one, dubbed the Age of Absolute, is still under investigation. Others are also trying to figure out if it's possible to do the Age of Star ending with Melina still alive, just to see if something changes, since of course the growing theory is that they are related. However, at the time of making this video, none of this has gotten anywhere, so we'll have to wait and see. With that, however, we come to the end of Elden Ring, and subsequently the end of the video. The amount of lore in the Soulsborne games is astronomical, and trying to catalog all of it then repeat it to an audience is incredibly challenging. But I think I did a good job providing a clear and simple timeline of events for all of you. Feel free to watch any of my other story explained videos on different games in the industry, or if you prefer to listen to a review rather than a retelling, I made a few videos discussing the stories of specific games like the BioShock series and Fallout 4 that you may enjoy. With that, like the video if you enjoy and subscribe if you're new. And thank you as always to my returning viewers for coming back to another video. Take care everyone, and goodbye.